The moment Marcus told me I was too fat for him to love anymore, I never imagined I'd one day be sitting in my marble-floored mansion, watching him scrub my toilet in a crisp butler's uniform. But here we are, 3 years later, and the lottery ticket I bought with my last $20 has made all the difference in the world. I can still feel the exact texture of that February morning when my world collapsed. The way the kitchen tile felt cold against my bare feet as I stood there in my pajamas, holding 2 cups of coffee I'd made for us like I did every morning for 3 years. The steam rising from the mugs created this little cloud between us, and I remember thinking how it looked like a barrier, like something was already separating us before he even opened his mouth. Marcus was sitting at our small dining table, the one we'd bought together at IKEA during our first month of living together. His fingers drummed against the wood, and that nervous energy radiating from him made my stomach clench. I knew something was wrong the moment I woke up and felt the space next to me in bed still cold, realizing he'd been up for hours. Setting his coffee down in front of him, I noticed how he wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze kept darting to the window, to the wall, to his hands, anywhere but my face. The pit in my stomach grew heavier. Then he said it. Those words that would replay in my mind for months afterward, each syllable carved into my memory like scars. He told me he couldn't do this anymore, that he'd been thinking about it for weeks, that when we first met I was different, smaller, more attractive to him. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, and I watched it shatter against the floor in slow motion. Brown liquid spread across the white tiles, seeping into the grout lines. I stood there paralyzed as he continued talking. His voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. He explained how he'd tried to ignore it, tried to love me the way I was now, but he couldn't help how he felt. Physical attraction mattered to him, he said. He needed to be with someone who took better care of themselves. Someone who didn't let themselves go the way I had. My hands started shaking first, then my entire body followed. I looked down at myself, at the extra 30 pounds I'd gained since we'd been together. The weight that had crept on slowly during our comfortable relationship, when we'd spent evenings cooking together, ordering takeout, being happy. I thought we'd been happy. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was the relief I saw in his eyes as he said them. Like he'd been carrying this burden for months and was finally free of it. Like my heartbreak was his liberation. I remember walking to the bathroom afterward, my legs moving on autopilot while my mind went completely blank. I stared at myself in the mirror, seeing my face for the first time through his eyes. My cheeks did look fuller, my chin softer, my body rounder in places it hadn't been before. The shame hit me like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I'd been so comfortable, so secure in our love, that I'd stopped seeing myself clearly. I'd stopped worrying about my appearance because I thought he loved me unconditionally. How naive. How incredibly foolishly naive. Marcus packed his things that afternoon while I sat on our couch, watching him move through our shared space like he was erasing himself from my life. 3 years together, and he managed to remove every trace of himself in under 2 hours. His clothes, his books, his coffee mug, the picture of us from last Christmas, gone. The apartment felt massive and empty after he left. Every corner held a memory, every room echoed with conversations we'd never have again. I wandered from the kitchen to the bedroom to the living room, lost in my own home. That night, I cried until my eyes were swollen shut. I cried for the relationship I'd lost, for the future we'd planned together, for the person I thought I was versus who I apparently had become. But mostly I cried from the humiliation. The deep, burning shame of being told you're not good enough, not attractive enough, not worthy enough to be loved. The next morning I called in sick to work. And the morning after that? By the end of the week, I'd barely eaten anything and couldn't bring myself to shower or change clothes. My reflection had become my enemy. Every time I caught sight of myself, I heard his voice again, cataloging my flaws, explaining why I wasn't worth loving anymore. My sister Emma called every day, but I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't bear to hear the pity in her voice when I told her what happened. I couldn't handle having to explain that my boyfriend of 3 years had dumped me for gaining weight, like I was some shallow character in a bad romantic comedy. But isolation wasn't healing me. It was making everything worse. The shame was fermenting, turning into something darker and more corrosive. I'd lie in bed replaying every moment of our relationship, analyzing every time he'd seemed less affectionate, every comment about my appearance I'd brushed off, every instance where I should have seen this coming. 2 weeks after he left, I finally answered Emma's call. The moment I heard her voice, I broke down completely. Through broken sobs, I told her everything. How he'd said I'd let myself go. How he couldn't find me attractive anymore. How 3 years of love had apparently been conditional on my dress size. Emma was furious. I could hear her pacing on the other end of the line, muttering things I couldn't quite make out, but that sounded decidedly unflattering toward Marcus. She wanted to drive over immediately, wanted to take me out, wanted to help me slash his tires, but I wasn't ready for action. I was still drowning in the aftermath. The worst part about heartbreak, I realized, is how it makes you question everything. Had I really let myself go, or had I just become comfortable? Was I actually unattractive now, or was he just cruel? Were the 30 pounds I'd gained really that significant, or was this about something deeper? I spent hours looking at old photos of us together, trying to see what he saw. In our early pictures, I was definitely thinner. My face was more angular, my body more defined. But I'd been stressed then, working long hours and barely eating. I'd actually been healthier with him, eating regular meals, feeling secure enough to relax. But apparently, relaxation was unattractive. Comfort was undesirable. The version of me that had been confident enough to enjoy life without constantly monitoring my appearance was the version he couldn't love. A month after the breakup, I saw him at the grocery store. My heart stopped when I spotted him in the produce section, casually examining apples like he hadn't destroyed my entire sense of self-worth 4 weeks earlier. He looked exactly the same, of course. Unfazed, unaffected, moving through his life like our relationship had never existed. What made it worse was that he wasn't alone. The woman with him was thin. Probably a size 6, with long blonde hair and the kind of effortless beauty that made my chest tighten with envy and self-loathing. She was laughing at something he'd said, and he was looking at her the way he used to look at me. Before I gained weight, before I became unworthy of that expression, I abandoned my cart and rushed out of the store, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get my keys in the ignition. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage, and the crushing realization that he'd already moved on. Already found someone who met his standards. Someone who wouldn't let herself go. That night, something shifted inside me. The sadness was still there, but it was joined by something else. Something harder and more focused. Anger. Pure, crystalline anger that felt like a flame in my chest. I wasn't angry at him for leaving me. People can't help who they're attracted to, and I understood that on an intellectual level. But I was furious at how he'd done it. The cruelty of his words. The casual way he'd dismantled my self-esteem. The fact that he'd made me feel like my worth as a person was tied to my dress size. And I was angry at myself for believing him. For internalizing his judgment and letting it define how I saw myself. For spending weeks hating my own reflection instead of recognizing that his shallowness was his problem, not mine. The anger felt better than the sadness. It was active instead of passive, empowering instead of diminishing. It made me want to do something instead of just lying in bed feeling sorry for myself. So I started going to the gym, not because I wanted to win him back or prove anything to him, but because I wanted to feel strong again. I wanted to reclaim my body as something that belonged to me, not something that existed for his approval. The first few workouts were brutal. My muscles screamed, my lungs burned, and I felt self-conscious about every movement. But gradually I started to enjoy it. The physical exertion gave me somewhere to channel all the anger and hurt I'd been carrying around. Every mile on the treadmill was a mile away from the person who'd made me feel worthless. I also started seeing a therapist. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that Marcus's rejection wasn't really about my weight. It was about his inability to love someone unconditionally. His need for a partner who existed as an accessory to his ego rather than a whole person with her own complexities. 3 months after the breakup, I felt like myself again. Not the self that had existed before Marcus, but a newer, stronger version. Someone who understood her own worth independent of anyone else's opinion. That's when I bought the lottery ticket. It was completely impulsive. I was walking home from the gym, feeling good about myself for the first time in months, when I passed the corner store where I always used to buy coffee. On a whim, I went in and spent my last $20 on a lottery ticket. The numbers I chose were random, meaningless. I wasn't expecting anything from it. A week later, I was sitting in my apartment eating dinner when the lottery numbers were announced on TV. I wasn't even paying attention at first. The television was just background noise while I read, but something made me look up, made me grab the ticket from my coffee table and compare the numbers. The first number matched, then the second, the third, the fourth. By the time I realized all 6 numbers were identical to mine, I was hyperventilating. $57 million? After taxes, it would be about $35 million, but still, $35 million. Enough money to completely transform my life. Enough money to never worry about anything again. Enough money to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. The first person I called was Emma. She screamed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. The second person I called was Dr. Martinez, because I needed someone to help me process what this meant, what I should do next. But there was a third call I didn't make. A call to Marcus, to rub this incredible fortune in his face. The old me, the one still raw from his rejection, would have called him immediately. Would have wanted him to know that the woman he'd deemed unworthy was now worth more than he'd ever be. But I didn't call him, because he no longer had that kind of power over me. The lottery commission required me to wait 2 weeks before claiming the prize, something about verification and legal procedures. 2 weeks to sit with this life-changing secret, to plan what I wanted to do with this incredible gift. That's when the idea began to form. I spent those 2 weeks researching, looking into Marcus's life, his career, his circumstances. It wasn't hard to find information. Social media made people's lives remarkably transparent, and Marcus had never been particularly private. He was working at the same marketing firm where he'd been when we were together, still living in the same apartment complex, though he'd moved to a different unit. Still dating the blonde woman from the grocery store, based on his Instagram posts. Her name was Jessica, and she was exactly what I'd expected. Young, thin, conventionally beautiful in that effortless way that had made me feel so inadequate. But there were other details too. Complaints on his company's employee review sites about layoffs and pay cuts, a LinkedIn post from 6 months ago about struggling to find new opportunities in a competitive market, a Facebook status from his roommate about rent increases forcing them to look for cheaper places. Marcus wasn't doing as well as his social media presence suggested. He was struggling, just like most people our age. The difference was that now I had the power to change that struggle, to make it worse or to make it better, depending on my mood. The more I thought about it, the more perfect the plan became. I wouldn't contact him directly. I wouldn't reveal who I was or make this obviously about revenge. I would simply create an opportunity that he couldn't refuse, and then watch as karma played out in real time. First, I claimed my lottery prize. The media attention was unavoidable, but I kept the interviews brief and vague. A lucky winner who planned to invest wisely and live quietly. No mention of heartbreak or revenge or the specific plans already forming in my mind. With the money secured, I started building the infrastructure for my plan. I hired lawyers, accountants, and investment advisors. I bought a mansion in the hills overlooking the city, a sprawling estate with more rooms than I could possibly use. I purchased luxury cars, expensive art, and all the trappings of sudden wealth. But the most important purchase was the one nobody saw coming. I bought Marcus's marketing firm. It wasn't difficult. The company was struggling financially, the owners were eager to sell, and I had more money than they'd ever dreamed of. The transaction was handled through multiple shell companies and legal entities, making it impossible to trace back to me directly. Within a month, I owned the company where Marcus worked. I controlled his job, his salary, his entire professional future, and he had no idea. The first phase of my plan was subtle. I had the new management implement efficiency reviews, performance evaluations, and restructuring initiatives. Nothing unusual for a company under new ownership, but enough to create uncertainty and anxiety among the employees. Marcus's performance reviews were particularly thorough. Not unfairly negative, but detailed enough to highlight areas where improvement was needed. His sales numbers were scrutinized. His client relationships were evaluated. His future with the company was quietly called into question. Through intermediaries, I learned that he was stressed about his job security, that he and Jessica were fighting about money, that the confident, cavalier man who had dismissed me so easily was now experiencing his own version of uncertainty and fear. It felt better than I'd expected it to. The second phase involved creating an opportunity. I had my estate manager post a job listing for a personal butler. The salary was extraordinary, nearly triple what Marcus was making at his marketing job. The benefits were comprehensive, the working conditions described as luxurious. It was the kind of opportunity that someone in financial distress couldn't afford to ignore. The job description was crafted carefully. I wanted someone with marketing experience, someone who understood client relations and personal service. Someone who could adapt to the eccentricities of sudden wealth and maintain absolute discretion about their employer's personal life. I knew Marcus would apply. His background made him a perfect candidate, and his financial situation made the salary irresistible. The only question was whether he'd be able to handle the interview process without recognizing me. That's where the physical transformation came in. I'd been working out consistently for 8 months by then, and the changes were dramatic. I'd lost 40 pounds, gaining muscle and definition I'd never had before. My hair was different too, shorter and darker, styled in a way that changed the entire shape of my face. Professional makeup, expensive clothes, and the confidence that came with unlimited resources had transformed me into someone almost unrecognizable from the woman Marcus had dumped. But the most important change wasn't physical, it was psychological. I carried myself differently now. I spoke with authority, moved with purpose, commanded attention in a way that the old me never could have managed. Wealth and power had given me a presence that was impossible to ignore. The day of Marcus's interview, I sat in my study, watching through security cameras as he walked up the circular driveway to my front door. He was nervous, I could tell. His suit was slightly too tight, probably the best one he owned, and he kept adjusting his tie as he approached the entrance. When my housekeeper led him into the study, I saw the exact moment he registered the opulence of his surroundings. His eyes widened as he took in the leather-bound books, the original artwork, the massive mahogany desk that cost more than his monthly rent. This was a level of wealth he'd never encountered before. I was sitting behind that desk, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. I'd positioned myself deliberately, knowing the lighting would make it harder for him to see my features clearly, while I could observe every detail of his reaction. He introduced himself politely, professionally, clearly trying to make a good impression. His voice was the same, of course, but everything else about his demeanor was different. He was deferential, almost nervous, seeking approval instead of granting it. I asked him about his experience, his qualifications, his understanding of what the position would entail. He answered thoughtfully, emphasizing his client service background, his attention to detail, his ability to anticipate needs and provide seamless support. It was fascinating, watching him essentially audition to serve me. The man who had told me I wasn't worthy of his love was now desperately trying to convince me he was worthy of my employment. Throughout the interview, I studied his face for any sign of recognition, but there was nothing. The combination of my physical transformation and the context of the situation had made me completely invisible to him. I was just another wealthy stranger, someone whose approval he needed but whose identity was irrelevant. When I offered him the position, the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. He accepted immediately, thanking me profusely for the opportunity. We discussed start dates, responsibilities, and living arrangements. He would be provided with quarters on the estate, uniforms, and all the resources he needed to perform his duties excellently. He left that day with no idea that he'd just agreed to work as a servant for the woman whose heart he'd broken less than a year earlier. His first day was a Tuesday in October. I watched from my bedroom window as he arrived at 7 in the morning, carrying a single suitcase and looking determined to make a good impression. The head of household staff, Mrs. Chen, met him at the servants' entrance and began his orientation. The uniform looked good on him, I had to admit. Crisp white shirt, black vest, tailored trousers. It was dignified but unmistakably subservient, marking him clearly as someone whose job was to cater to my needs and desires. His initial duties were relatively simple: serving meals, managing my calendar, coordinating with other staff members, maintaining the cleanliness and organization of my personal spaces. Nothing too demanding, but enough to establish the clear hierarchy between us. I found excuses to interact with him throughout that first week, testing whether proximity would trigger any recognition. I'd call him into my study to discuss menu planning, or ask him to serve tea while I worked. Each time he was professional and courteous, treating me like exactly what I appeared to be: his wealthy employer. The psychological satisfaction was intoxicating. Every time he said "yes, ma'am," or "right away, ma'am," I felt a surge of vindication. This was the man who had made me feel worthless, now devoted to ensuring my comfort and happiness. But I wanted more than just the power dynamic. I wanted him to understand what he had lost. I wanted him to realize that the woman he'd rejected was now so far above his social station that he literally worked for her. I wanted recognition, acknowledgement, some sign that karma had not gone unnoticed. So I began dropping hints, subtle references to our shared past, mentions of things only we would know. I'd comment on movies we'd watched together, reference restaurants where we'd had dates, bring up topics that had been important to our relationship. But Marcus showed no signs of understanding. If anything, he seemed pleased by these coincidental similarities in our tastes. He'd smile and nod when I mentioned preferring Thai food, or express agreement when I criticized a particular film. He thought we simply had compatible preferences, not realizing he was hearing echoes of his own past opinions. After 2 weeks of subtle hints achieving nothing, I decided to be more direct. I had him serve dinner in the formal dining room, just the two of us at opposite ends of a table that could seat 20. The chandelier cast dramatic shadows across the room, and I'd chosen candles instead of electric lighting to create an intimate, slightly unsettling atmosphere. Halfway through the meal, I started talking about relationships. About how people can be so shallow, so focused on superficial qualities that they miss what really matters. I spoke about men who judge women based on their appearance, who throw away real connections for purely physical reasons. Marcus nodded along politely, making appropriately sympathetic sounds. He agreed that people could be cruel about such things, that it was unfortunate when relationships ended over petty concerns. I pushed further. I mentioned a friend who'd been dumped by her boyfriend for gaining weight, how devastating it had been for her self-esteem, how cruel and unnecessary the whole situation was. Again, Marcus expressed sympathy. He shook his head at the thoughtlessness of such behavior, mentioned that real love should be unconditional, suggested that any man who would do such a thing clearly didn't deserve the woman he'd lost. The irony was suffocating. He was literally condemning his own actions while serving the woman he'd victimized, and he had no idea. The cognitive dissonance was so profound I almost laughed out loud. That night, I realized that subtle manipulation wasn't going to work. Marcus wasn't going to recognize me through hints and suggestions. If I wanted him to understand what had happened, I was going to have to tell him directly. But the timing had to be perfect. I needed him to be completely invested in this job, completely dependent on my goodwill, before I revealed the truth. I needed him to understand exactly how much power I now held over his life. So I waited, and while I waited, I made his life as comfortable as possible. I praised his work, gave him raises, treated him with the kind of respect and appreciation he'd never shown me. I wanted him to feel secure, valued, grateful for this opportunity. Within a month, Marcus was thriving in his new role. The financial stress that had been weighing on him disappeared. He was able to afford nice things again, to take Jessica on proper dates, to feel confident about his future. I could see the relief in his posture, the way he carried himself with renewed assurance. He told Mrs. Chen how grateful he was for this job, how lucky he felt to work for such a generous and understanding employer. He said he'd never had a boss who treated him with such consideration, who seemed to genuinely care about his well-being. The irony was delicious. The woman he'd deemed unworthy of love was now the source of his financial security and professional satisfaction. The person whose feelings he'd crushed without a second thought was now responsible for his happiness and stability. But I still wanted more. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted him to face what he'd done, to confront the consequences of his callousness. I wanted justice, not just revenge. The opportunity came during the Christmas season. I decided to host a holiday party for my staff, a lavish celebration to show my appreciation for their hard work. Marcus was responsible for coordinating much of the event, working with caterers and decorators to ensure everything was perfect. The night of the party, I wore a dress I'd never have been able to fit into during our relationship, red silk that hugged my transformed body, emphasizing every curve I'd worked so hard to sculpt. My makeup was flawless, my hair styled elegantly, my jewelry expensive enough to feed a family for a year. I looked incredible and I knew it. More importantly, I looked nothing like the woman Marcus had dumped for being too fat. The party was in full swing when I approached him. He was checking on the catering staff, ensuring the appetizers were being served properly, completely focused on his duties. The perfect, dedicated employee. I tapped him on the shoulder and asked if I could speak with him privately. He followed me to my study, probably assuming I wanted to discuss some aspect of the party or provide feedback on his work. Once we were alone, I closed the door and turned to face him. The moment had finally arrived. I told him to sit down. There was something in my tone that made him comply immediately, though confusion was written across his features. He'd never heard me speak with such intensity before. I poured myself a glass of wine, taking my time, letting the silence build. Then I turned back to him and said his name. Not Marcus, which I'd been calling him for weeks, but Mark. The nickname I'd used when we were together, the intimate shortening that only people close to him were allowed to use. His brow furrowed slightly, but still no recognition. So I kept going. I mentioned the apartment we'd shared, the IKEA table where he'd broken my heart, the specific words he'd used to explain why I was no longer worthy of his love. I watched his face as understanding began to dawn. The confusion shifted to surprise, then to shock, then to something approaching horror as he realized who was standing in front of him. The woman he'd discarded for being too fat was now his employer. The person whose self-esteem he'd destroyed with casual cruelty was now responsible for his livelihood. The relationship he'd ended because he couldn't find me attractive anymore had led directly to him serving me as a literal servant. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. He looked like he was seeing a ghost, which in a way he was. The ghost of his own conscience finally coming back to haunt him. I let him absorb the revelation in silence. I wanted him to fully understand the situation before I said anything else. I wanted him to feel the weight of cosmic justice settling around his shoulders like a lead blanket. When he finally found his voice, all he could manage was my name, spoken like a question, like he still couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. I confirmed his worst fears. Yes, it was me. Yes, I was the lottery winner he'd been reading about in the news. Yes, I was the wealthy woman he'd been serving faithfully for the past 2 months. And yes, I remembered every word of our last conversation in vivid, painful detail. The color drained from his face as the full implications hit him. This wasn't just an awkward coincidence or an embarrassing revelation. This was a complete reversal of power, a cosmic joke that had made him financially dependent on the woman he'd rejected. He started to stammer out an apology, but I held up my hand to stop him. I wasn't interested in apologies. I was interested in acknowledgement. I asked him if he remembered what he'd said about physical attraction being important to him, about needing to be with someone who took better care of themselves, about how I'd let myself go and become unworthy of his love. He nodded miserably, clearly wishing he could disappear. I walked over to the full-length mirror on the wall and stood in front of it, smoothing my hands over my dress. Then I asked him what he thought of my appearance now. Did I meet his standards? Was this version of me attractive enough to be worthy of his affection? The question was cruel and I knew it, but I'd earned the right to be cruel. I'd paid for it with months of self-doubt and shame, with tears cried in bathroom mirrors and nights spent wondering if I'd ever be worthy of love again. Marcus couldn't answer. He just sat there, staring at me with an expression of complete devastation. So I answered for him. I told him that it didn't matter what he thought of my appearance now, because his opinion was no longer relevant to my life. He'd forfeited the right to judge my worth when he'd chosen to value me based solely on my dress size. I explained that the lottery money had given me many things. Financial security, certainly. Freedom and power and opportunities I'd never dreamed of. But most importantly, it had given me the ability to show him exactly what he'd lost when he'd chosen shallow attraction over genuine connection. The woman he'd dismissed as too fat was now wealthy enough to buy and sell him like a commodity. The person he'd made feel worthless was now responsible for his financial stability. The relationship he'd thrown away for superficial reasons had led directly to him serving me meals and cleaning my house. I could see him struggling to process the cosmic unfairness of it all. He'd made a choice based on what he thought was practical, logical, even necessary. He'd prioritized his physical attraction and assumed there would be no consequences for breaking someone's heart in service of his own desires. But there had been consequences, just not the ones he'd expected. I told him he could keep his job if he wanted to. The salary was still generous, the working conditions still comfortable, the benefits still comprehensive. Nothing about his employment status had to change, just because we now both knew who was really in control. But I wanted him to understand that every day he chose to stay would be a reminder of what he'd given up. Every meal he served me, every task he completed, every "yes, ma'am" he uttered would be an acknowledgement that the woman he'd deemed unworthy was now the most important person in his professional life. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. I could practically see him running through his options, calculating what this revelation meant for his future. He needed this job. He couldn't afford to quit, not with Jessica's expectations and his own financial obligations. But staying meant accepting a level of cosmic humiliation that most people could never endure. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet, defeated but determined. He said he understood the situation completely. He acknowledged that he'd been cruel and shallow in how he'd ended our relationship, He admitted that he deserved whatever consequences had resulted from his choices, and then he said something that surprised me. He told me he was glad I'd found success and happiness, that seeing me now, confident and powerful and clearly thriving, made him realize how much he'd underestimated me when we were together. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that his judgment had been flawed, that his values had been misplaced, that his treatment of me had been inexcusable. I told him I appreciated his honesty, and then I told him to get back to the party. There were guests to attend to, and I expected my staff to maintain their professional standards regardless of personal complications. He left the study looking shell-shocked but determined. Within minutes, he was back to his duties, ensuring the party ran smoothly, maintaining the facade of normalcy while internally grappling with the most surreal plot twist of his life. I rejoined the party as well, mingling with my staff, accepting their compliments on the event, playing the gracious hostess. But my attention kept drifting to Marcus, watching how he handled the revelation, looking for any sign that this new dynamic was too much for him to bear. He was professional, I had to give him that. Despite the emotional bombshell I'd just dropped, he continued doing his job flawlessly. He coordinated with the catering staff, ensured guests had everything they needed, maintained the smooth operation of the entire event, but I could see the strain in his posture, the tension in his movements. This was a man processing the most humbling experience of his life while simultaneously trying to prove he deserved to keep the job that had become his lifeline. The party ended successfully, with staff and guests alike praising the event's elegance and organization. As people began to leave, I made a point of publicly thanking Marcus for his exceptional work in coordinating everything. The praise was genuine, but it was also strategic. I wanted everyone to see that despite our personal history, I valued his professional contributions. After the last guest departed and the cleanup was complete, Marcus approached me one final time that evening. He asked if we could speak privately again, and I agreed. Back in my study, he was more composed than he'd been during our earlier conversation, but the weight of the situation was still evident in his eyes. He thanked me for allowing him to keep his position despite the complicated circumstances. He promised that he would continue to perform his duties to the best of his ability, regardless of our personal history. Then he asked the question I'd been expecting. Why had I done this? Why had I orchestrated this elaborate revenge instead of simply confronting him directly or moving on with my life? I considered the question carefully before answering. The truth was complex, layered with motivations I was still unpacking myself. I told him that when he'd broken up with me, he'd made me question my fundamental worth as a person. He'd reduced 3 years of love, intimacy, and partnership to a simple equation about physical attraction and personal maintenance. He'd made me feel like my value existed solely in how well I met his aesthetic preferences. That kind of rejection doesn't just hurt in the moment. It creates lasting damage to how you see yourself, how you interact with the world, how you believe others perceive you. It took months of therapy and personal work to rebuild the self-esteem he'd destroyed in a single conversation. So when the lottery gave me the power to reverse our positions, to make him dependent on my approval and goodwill, it felt like justice. Not just revenge, but actual cosmic balance being restored to a situation that had been fundamentally unfair. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have your security and happiness dependent on someone else's judgment. I wanted him to experience the vulnerability of needing approval from someone whose opinion could make or break your future. But more than that, I wanted him to see who I really was. Not just the woman he'd rejected for gaining weight, but someone capable of building an empire, of commanding respect, of wielding power with both grace and strength. I wanted him to realize that his shallow assessment of my worth had been catastrophically wrong. Marcus listened to my explanation without interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded slowly. He said he understood why I'd felt the need to do this, and that he probably deserved worse than what I'd arranged. He also said something that caught me off guard. He told me that working for me over the past 2 months had been the best job experience of his career, not just because of the salary and benefits, but because I'd treated him with more respect and consideration than any boss he'd ever had. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The woman he'd treated as disposable had become the employer who valued his contributions and supported his professional growth. The person whose feelings he'd disregarded had created an environment where he felt appreciated and respected. He asked if there was any chance we could eventually move past this dynamic, if we could ever interact as equals again rather than employer and servant. It was a vulnerable question, one that suggested he was beginning to understand the depth of what he'd lost when he'd ended our relationship. I told him honestly that I didn't know. The power dynamic between us had been deliberately constructed, and it served important psychological purposes for both of us. He was learning humility and the consequences of shallow judgment. I was experiencing the validation and control that had been absent from our original relationship. Whether we could eventually transcend this arrangement would depend on how we both grew from the experience. If he could genuinely internalize the lessons about empathy and respect, and if I could find healing and closure through this process, maybe we could eventually relate to each other as equals again. But that was a possibility for the future, not a guarantee. For now, the arrangement was exactly what both of us needed, even if only one of us had chosen it. The months that followed established a strange but stable routine. Marcus continued excelling in his duties, and I continued treating him with professional respect while maintaining clear boundaries about our respective roles. The psychological dynamic was fascinating to observe. Having power over his financial security had given me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Every day that he chose to stay, to accept my authority and cater to my needs, was a validation that I was worthy of respect and consideration. But it was also changing me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Having someone's livelihood in my hands was a responsibility I took seriously. I found myself becoming more thoughtful about my decisions, more aware of how my moods and preferences affected someone else's life. Marcus was changing too. The arrogance and casual cruelty that had characterized our breakup were gone, replaced by genuine humility and consideration. He'd learned to think before speaking, to consider how his words might affect others, to treat everyone around him with the kind of respect he'd failed to show me. 6 months into this arrangement, Jessica broke up with him. I learned about it through Mrs. Chen, who mentioned that Marcus had seemed particularly distracted lately and had confided in her about relationship troubles. The news brought up complicated feelings. Part of me felt vindicated that his rebound relationship had failed, that the woman he'd chosen over me hadn't provided the happiness he'd expected. But another part of me felt genuinely sorry for him. Heartbreak was painful regardless of whether someone deserved it, and I knew better than anyone how devastating rejection could be. When I next interacted with Marcus, I could see the hurt in his eyes, the same lost, bewildered expression I'd probably worn when he'd ended our relationship. The difference was that now I had the power to show him kindness or withhold it, to make his pain worse or help him heal. I chose kindness. I gave him a few days off to process the breakup, with full pay and no questions asked. When he returned to work, I made sure his duties were lighter than usual, giving him space to grieve without having to put on a completely professional facade. It was during this period that something shifted between us. The dynamic was still employer and employee, but the emotional undertones became more complex. I was no longer just the wronged ex-girlfriend wielding power over her former tormentor. I was someone who understood his pain and chose to respond with compassion rather than cruelty. One evening, about a week after his breakup, Marcus approached me as I was reading in the garden. He asked if he could speak freely, not as employee to employer, but as one person to another. I agreed, curious about what he wanted to say. He told me that over the past few months, he'd had a lot of time to think about our relationship and how it had ended. He'd come to understand that his reasons for breaking up with me had been shallow and hurtful, but more than that, he'd realized how much he'd taken for granted. He said that I'd been the most supportive, understanding partner he'd ever had, that I'd made him feel loved and accepted in ways no one else had before or since. That in focusing so obsessively on physical attraction, he'd thrown away something infinitely more valuable. It was the apology I'd been waiting for since that February morning when my world had collapsed. Not just an acknowledgement that he'd been cruel, but genuine understanding of what he'd lost and why it mattered. But hearing it now, after months of having power over him, the words felt different than I'd imagined they would. Less satisfying, more bittersweet. Because I'd changed too, and the person I was now could never go back to the relationship we'd had before. I told him I appreciated his honesty and that I could see he'd grown from the experience. But I also told him that some things couldn't be undone. The trust he'd broken, the security he'd shattered, the self-doubt he'd created, those wounds had healed but left scars. He nodded, accepting the reality that his choices had permanent consequences. But then he surprised me by saying he wasn't asking for another chance at romance. He was asking for the possibility of friendship, of mutual respect, of some kind of connection that acknowledged our shared history without being trapped by it. It was a mature request, one that showed genuine growth and understanding. And after months of watching him work hard, treat others with kindness, and accept his circumstances with grace, I found myself genuinely considering it. I told him that friendship might be possible eventually, but it would require continued growth from both of us. He would need to keep proving that his change in perspective was genuine and lasting. I would need to work through my own feelings about power, control, and forgiveness. The conversation marked a turning point in our dynamic. We were still employer and employee, but the underlying hostility had been replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Not reconciliation, but the possibility of eventually moving beyond the hurt. As my first year as a lottery winner drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed. The money had given me financial freedom, certainly, but it had also given me something more valuable: the power to rewrite the narrative of the most painful experience of my life. Instead of being the woman who'd been discarded for gaining weight, I'd become the woman who'd risen above such shallow judgment. Instead of being the victim of someone else's cruelty, I'd become the architect of cosmic justice. Instead of being powerless in the face of rejection, I'd claimed absolute control over the situation. But the most unexpected outcome was how the experience had changed both of us. Marcus had learned empathy, humility, and the true cost of treating others poorly. I'd learned about the responsibility that comes with power and the complexity of justice. Was it revenge? Absolutely. Was it deserved? I believed so. Was it healing? More than I'd ever imagined it could be. The woman who'd bought that lottery ticket with her last $20 had been broken, angry, and desperate for validation. The woman counting down to the new year in her mansion, with her former boyfriend now serving her faithfully, was confident, powerful, and surprisingly at peace with the entire situation. Marcus was still my employee, still dependent on my goodwill, still living with the daily reminder of how catastrophically he'd misjudged my worth. But he was also becoming someone I could respect again, someone who'd learned from his mistakes and was working to be better. Whether he would remain my butler forever or eventually move on to other opportunities was unclear. Whether we would ever truly be friends or simply maintain a professional relationship was also uncertain. But what was clear was that both of us had been fundamentally changed by this experience. He'd learned that treating people as disposable has consequences, that shallow judgments can lead to profound losses, and that the people you underestimate might surprise you in ways you never imagined. And I'd learned that revenge, when executed with patience and precision, could be more satisfying than anything I'd ever experienced. But I'd also learned that true healing comes not from wielding power over others, but from reclaiming power over yourself. As I sat in my study that New Year's Eve, watching Marcus coordinate the staff for my holiday party, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: genuine contentment. Not happiness exactly, because the situation was still too complex for simple joy, but satisfaction, completion, the sense that justice had been served and balance had been restored. He dumped me for being too fat. Then I won the lottery and hired him as my butler. It wasn't the ending either of us had expected, but it was exactly the ending both of us had earned.